Thousands took to the streets of Georgia's capital, Tbilisi, when the government proposed a foreign agent bill. Critics described the law as Russia-style, and the show of public anger led to it being withdrawn. On the face of it, the demonstrations appeared to highlight the country's political fault lines. There's a pro-Russian elite versus a pro-European Union public. But is it really as straightforward as that? Welcome to Roundtable. I'm Philip Hampsheir. Among the thousands that crowded Tbilisi over the foreign agents law, many of them were waving European Union flags. This contrasts with the ruling Georgian Dream Party, which is seen as being closer to the Kremlin, in no small part because of alleged financial links. Georgia has not been keen to support sanctions against Moscow over the conflict in Ukraine and is even reportedly helping circumvent some of them. Of course, a Russia-backed government versus a pro-European populace has real echoes of the Maidan revolution in Kyiv that led to the current bloodshed in Ukraine. So just how similar is the situation in Georgia? So let's meet our guests. From Tbilisi, we have Manana Kochladze, who is a Democratisation and Human Rights Strategic Area Leader at CE Bankwatch Network. Meanwhile, from Tbilisi as well, Tornike Sharashenidze, who is a professor of the Georgian Institute of Public Affairs. And in London, we have Domitilla Sagramoso, who's a senior lecturer in security and development at King's College London. Thank you, everyone, for joining me. Manana, first question to you. How would you describe the situation in Georgia today?
We can describe it as the calm, but it's the calmness before the storm, because since the withdrawal of the law, government and Parliament of Georgia starting the really huge defamation campaign against the civil society groups. They are calling them directly the foreign agents. There is huge undermining campaign against the youth that have been protesting in Tbilisi streets a few days ago. So from one side, the government claims that they want to go into the European Union, but from another side, the actions they are undertaking, even after they themselves admit that there was very wrong to go with this law to the parliament in this way, they still trying to sell this not as the defeat of their policy, but rather than, finding the agents of the West, actually, if I understand correctly, who are damaging the Georgian democracy and trying to build their capital on it.
Tornike, same question to you. How do you feel about the situation in Georgia? Manana's just described it as the calm before the storm.
Well, I would agree in a way, but I still believe that we're going to be okay unless the government, the ruling party commits another serious mistake like that notorious bill, on foreign agents. Now, what they did, I would call it a tactical retreat. They retreated, but that doesn't mean that definitely they are going to go away. I think they are going to. They are hoping to win the elections next year, parliamentary elections. The thing is that they may have suffered some setback now, but at the same time, it doesn't mean that opposition has got stronger. Opposition still remains weak, way weaker than the ruling party. That's the biggest problem for Georgia, I believe, because we're going to have elections next year, and the ruling party may still win it. But that means that they will remain in power for the four consecutive terms. And I don't think that they're going to enjoy very much support among young people here in Georgia and also among our Western partners. It's going to be a huge issue.
Domitilla, given that in the Western media, Georgia is usually described as having a pro-Russian elite or a more pro-Russian elite and a more pro-European Union or pro-European general populace. Nonetheless, the government with more pro-Russian sympathies does seem to keep getting re-elected. So is that an accurate reflection of Georgia, or is it overly simplistic?
Well, I think the perception in the European Union is that Georgia is trying to tread this ambivalent path of keeping good relations with Russia and at the same time not moving away from its sort of Euro-Atlantic aspirations. And I think that the leadership of the Georgian Dream and the sort of oligarch or Ivanishvili, who's sort of behind the scenes in many ways, is trying to a certain extent not to upset the Kremlin too much. And I think this law, there's strong suspicion that this was very much sort of pushed from the Kremlin, from the Russian side. And I think that, that creates problems, of course, internally in Georgia, and that also raises a lot of questions for the European Union, not only because of its sort of more sort of alignment with Russia to a certain extent, its decision not to impose sanctions on Russia, concerns that Georgia could become a transit country also for the sort of the bypass of sanctions. So there are a lot of issues of concern that are related also to the war in Ukraine and the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia, but also on internal developments, on the way in which the regime is taking control over sort of judicial institutions, over control over the media, cracking on NGOs, and of course its latest episodes, trying to crack against demonstrations which opposed this. So I think there are a lot of questions which are of concern. And there is an understanding, and maybe that Georgia is in this difficult position, but at the same time, there is also concern, I think in Europe generally about developments in Georgia and in the South Caucasus, and Europeans in general already are dealing with the question of Ukraine and the potential
Domitilla,
integration.
Yes. When we're talking about the European Union and the US and their reactions towards Georgia, they're complaining about this foreign agents bill. They're all saying that this is, if you like, a Russian-sponsored or a Russian-leaning piece of legislation, which of course has now been removed. But the United States has an anti-foreign agents bill. The European Union has an anti-foreign agents bill. Plenty of countries around the world either have one or have debated putting one into place. Is there anything specific about the Georgian bill that has made people think, no, this one is different?
I think the concern is that this law, sets a precedent towards, further cracking on foreign support for NGOs and NGOs in general, and that it would follow the similar path to other processes that were taking place in Russia, where initially it just reflected some kind of connection or sort of receiving foreign funding, and then there was an increasing crackdown on those organizations and institutions and NGOs that had connections with the West or foreign funding or were simply in opposition to the government.
Okay,
and I think that the major concern is that the government, the regime in Georgia will follow the same path. And I think that is what really worries Georgians. But I think my two colleagues on the panel are probably better prepared to,
let me pass that across.
How Georgians feel about this.
Let me pass that over to Manana. Manana, what are your feelings about this bill? What was it in the bill that really got people worked up and angry about it? As I said, there are plenty of places in the world where journalists, for instance, in the United States who work for state broadcasters sometimes have to register as foreign agents.
The problem of this law was, first of all, that it was not really looking, the purpose of the law was not looking for the national security. It was just looking to increasing transparency of the NGOs. So that was already bad sign and bad practice, which was coming from Russia, And then it was very funny, but all the Russian groups suddenly, who is directly operate here quite openly, all these ultra-nationalists and ultra-rightists, suddenly they have been saying that they don't receive any money from Russia, while we know that they are funding. And also, as you may know, in the parliament, they introduced two laws One was, as they claim, one was translation from the Russian law directly from 2021 actually, when the media organizations has been also involved, and from and another one was translation of the U.S. law. But what was very interesting in this translation of U.S. law, there was a really important part was somewhere forgot, and this important part was from which countries you should see the threats, because in US this enemy countries is defined by the president of US, and this most important article, which is about the security of the country, has been lost. So at the end of the day, all our Western partners from the US, from the European Union member states, everybody who provide the support to the NGOs and media organizations, they became the foreign influence agents, not the actually people who are right now undermining Georgia's security. So that was the major concern, that this is not about national security, but that for undermining of the NGO and media sector.
Tornike, do you see that the same way?
Yeah, almost. The thing is that unlike the United States, which still has this law, Foreign Agents Registration Act, Georgia is still a fragile democracy. So the thing is that the Western donors who support non-governmental NGOs in Georgia, what they do, they cultivate, let's say, democratic values, Western values. So the law itself that was going to be passed, and it didn't happen, as you know, it definitely would not stop the activities of the NGOs in Georgia. But it was seen as a dangerous sign because people here, including myself, feared that it could become just the first step, and the next step could be limiting the activities of the NGO. And more importantly, European Union or the EU officials, they were adamant that this law went against Georgia's European aspirations. That's what, in my opinion, served as a trigger for protest rallies, which finally made the government to take this law to withdraw the bill.
Now, that makes perfect sense what you're saying, but I'm hearing a lot of they could have done this, they might have done this. Is the government really, as it is being painted in the Western press, is it a genuinely pro-Russian government, or is it merely a government in Georgia, and Russia's its biggest neighbour, and they have to show a certain amount of sympathy with their biggest trading partner to the north for a start?
It's not only having Russia as the biggest trade partner. It's first of all is having Russian troops stationed in 40 kilometers from Tbilisi, capital of Georgia. And since Russia launched the war in Ukraine, now we can't expect anything from them. That's the point.
And I'm assuming, Manana, you agree with that as well?
At the end of the day, it does not matter, are they genuinely pro-Russian or are they just playing the game to please the Russia? The problem is that they're creating the really big barriers to the European future of the Georgia. This is the most important things, because with the actions where they try to sit in the two chairs, it doesn't work, So, and as you know, some compromises often are leading to the bigger compromises and bigger mistakes. So in this particular situation, it's not important where they are standing for. The problem is what they already done, that it's already damaged the Georgia's possibility to get the EU candidacy status in the fall of 2023.
Domitilla, as Manana was saying there, Georgia has applied to join the European Union. It applied sort of in the summer of last year, 2022, which is a relatively recent application. But given their previous experiences with sort of talking about whether or not they wanted to join NATO, is it reasonable to say that this is the fault of a domestic government within Georgia, that it might be a long and delayed process to join the European Union? Or was there never really a lot of hope about it because the European Union has been relatively stuffy in the last decade about where it's going to expand to next?
Certainly, I mean, within the European Union, there is a sense that enlargement, sometimes, can't continue, constantly. And there are voices that would argue that it's better to consolidate, the integration of those countries that have, more recently become members. And, there's also countries, for example, in the Balkans that have been also on the waiting list for quite some time. So there is also an argument that these countries, should be given priority before, there is an enlargement into the South Caucasus, including Georgia. Having said that, I think that there is a genuine understanding within the European Union, especially as a result of the war in Ukraine, that countries such as Georgia, Moldova, and of course Ukraine, need to have some clear sort of hope that they would eventually become members. That this is not just simply sort of a talking shop and a delaying strategy. And I think that the talks are very serious of engagement. And I think the Georgians, from the reports that are coming out from the European Commission and the European Parliament, they are moving ahead with implementation of all the sort of the demands related primarily to the economy. There is a serious problem around politics and the question of, internal affairs in Georgia. And that certainly creates an obstacle. And I think that, events such as sort of the question around, the head of the opposition television channel in Georgia was sentenced. So, I mean, all these issues, raised a lot of concern. The situation of the former president Saakashvili, who's in prison and seems to be a very, very serious condition. So this reminds a bit of the situation in 2013 with Ukraine.
Let me take it across to Tornike. Tornike, we've got some figures here with regards to the Georgian population. They come from the National Democratic Institute, and the figures show Georgian reactions to, or if you like, pro-Russian sentiment in Georgia from 2022. According to these numbers, 81% of the domestic population in Georgia supports European Union membership, 73% support NATO membership. Now, Tornike, as I look at those numbers, and then I see the reactions of the Georgian government and the fact that everyone says the Georgian government is pro-Russian, how does it keep getting elected in this environment? How pro-Russian is the populace generally? How pro-European is the populace generally? And are they genuinely at odds with the government?
Well, the answer is simple, I guess many Georgians simply don't believe that Georgian government is pro-Russian. There are some Georgians who believe that Georgian government is pro-Russian. And another thing is that, as I had to repeat myself, despite the fact that the ruling party has serious issues, the opposition is much weaker. So Georgian people would vote to someone else, but this someone else has to prove that they are better than the ruling party. That's the point.
Manana, is that not principally the problem that Georgia has at the moment? The opposition is weak. They simply can't take the government on.
It is the problem because political life recently almost dead in Georgia because political parties are very weak, and actually for a while the ruling party and opposition really play the game, like who is more boo in the room, so they really balance each other. And unfortunately, the Saakashvili coming back directly before the last elections really play on the ruling party side, because while we are, as the NGOs are pushing for the to take him to the any European country to get the proper treatment, he is not most welcome person in this country because of the old problems we have from the national movement governance. And it needs to be understood by the political parties. What we right now needed in a way to have the really good political life here is we need the new faces. We don't need faces who are jumping from the Shevardnadze political party to the Saakashvili political party, the Ivanishvili political party. So if you all look in the same survey data, you will see that usually the people are like maybe 60, 70% are undecided, which is really huge number, yeah? And then the people either not voting, or there is also quite problematic election environment. Itself, election day is not really that nice. So all this creates the problems, and these are, I would agree, this is a systemic problem that needs to be addressed by the Georgians itself, and nobody except of Georgians could not change, that is the world.
Okay, now I take your point that obviously politicians, it happens in the UK, for instance, all the time, can hang on in their positions too long and then bounce around between different roles. And you look at it and go, where is the young talent? Where is the new talent? But if we look at Georgia since about 2003, 2004, since you underwent having a new prime minister instead of a state minister in charge, you've had 14 prime ministers in the space of 19 years. And so you can understand my position here as you say, how many more new faces do you want?
That's an issue. I mean, the Georgian constitutional model is different from that of the UK. Prime ministers here were mostly in charge of economic issues. You know, country was run by presidents. Only after the constitution has been changed, that was in 2012, only after that, prime ministers actually, being prime minister means something here.
So do you think, Tornike, do you think at the moment Georgia is in a stable position, or do you think that it's on the brink of something like, as we were hearing from Domitilla, something like potential velvet revolution or a new revolution as they had in Ukraine?
Georgia is definitely more stable than Ukraine used to be.
Okay, Domitilla, what do you think is the potential here for stability and a rosy future for Georgia? Or is it in a precarious position right now?
I think Georgia is in a precarious position just strategically, because it is, as was mentioned by the other speakers, you know, it is vulnerable to Russian influences, and it has a military presence of Russia inside its territory, and in some cases very close to the capital Tbilisi in South Ossetia, and also Abkhazia is, you know, there are Russian forces in Abkhazia, and so there is also always a danger that you know, Russia decides to sort of annex these territories, and we know in the case of Abkhazia there is no desire for annexation with Russia, but the case of South Ossetia and especially the leadership, you know, they've been always much more supportive of unification with Russia. So I think that puts always Georgia in a very vulnerable sort of position from the point of view of its own security. And that sometimes can translate on its internal developments. So while one could argue that, you know, the situation might be more stable and there is a process of consolidation, I think that, you know, the external realities, you know, are very shaky. And I think that, you know, I mean, on the one hand, paradoxically, the war, you know, in Ukraine brought a significant influx of Russians, which apparently are helping to develop the economy. There is a lot of, you know, tourism, transit of trade from Central Asia, development of the IT sector. So paradoxically, Georgia could, you know, in some ways has benefited from this conflict. At the same time, the leadership, I think, is you know, is in a way following much more of a pro-Kremlin line than in the past.
Well, so let me hold on very quickly, because we're nearing the end of the show. I just very quickly want to bring Manana in for one last comment. Manana, do you agree with all that? We've got protests that have been happening on the streets in Georgia. There are a lot of people in the West who are looking at Georgia and saying, I don't know if it's entirely stable, if there's going to be a revolution there or not. In your opinion, is Georgia relatively safe and stable right now, or is it in a risky position?
It's in risky position that the government of Georgia will decide to fully turn to the pro-Russian side, because for them it's much more easier rather than to listen all these critiques, which is right now coming to the West. And also they somehow been quite, I would say, distressed with the fact that somehow even in the debates of the European Parliament, you know, the Georgian people and the Georgian government have been handled differently. You know, I never heard this kind of the things. They speak about the Georgian people and then they speak about the Georgian government in a way that is not goes in the politics, yeah, usually. So that the major problem here is for that the government does not turn to the authoritarian regime. They have putting lots of the pressure last years in a way to have more, to be re-elected in 2024. But these are some kind of really good piece which they, and if they will go to this direction, I don't know how long the stability will continue, because there is too many interest in this country, and people of Georgia for sure does not following this pro-Russian stand.
Well,
we have too many suffered from Russia, so it's really big trauma for Russia, for Georgian people to follow Russia.
Manana, thank you very much for your time. Tornike, Domitilla, it's a pleasure having you all three of you on the show. Thank you. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate if you head on over to our YouTube channel. Just head there and search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me here and all of the team, thank you for watching and goodbye.